After her mother's passing, a little girl took her sister to a stranger and whispered, "Can we have milk?" Sunset painted the Montana plains in a hard, heartbreaking gold. Elias Thornton stood on the porch, where his wife's shadow still softened the boards, his fingers curled around nothing, as if he might clasp memory itself. Dust carved the lane into a white ribbon, and a wagon appeared, small as a beetle against the endless field. A child guided it, Clara, 8 years, with an old steadiness, her braid whipped in the wind, palms raw from the rains. Beside her a smaller shape lay bundled in a shawl, breaths shallow like a bell winding down. Mary, their mother, lay folded among sacks and an empty loaf, skin washed of color and hands that had stopped finding work. Animals paused in their chewing. A raven hesitated on a fence post as if the whole prairie had leaned in to listen. Clara halted at the gate with the decided calm of someone carrying too many impossible nights. She bent and spoke so low the wind might have blown away the words, "Can we have milk?" Those 3 syllables landed in Elias's chest with the force of a thrown stone, carrying miles of hunger and the ache of long, uncounted nights. Something inside him, brittle from loss, trembled in response, not pity alone, but a wild tenderness that threatened his solitude. Who had taught a child to steer through fever and blizzard? What hands had failed them along lonely roads? He stepped from the porch, the boards giving a slight complaining creak beneath his boots, and the expansive ranch that had kept him safe now felt fragile and askew. The secret beneath that shawl would demand an answer that could undo what remained or bind these lives in ways no one imagined. He moved toward them, knowing this night altered the rest forever. Elias Thornton rose before dawn, as he had for years, when the world was thin and the horizon still held last night's cold. His land stretched away from the farmhouse in a hard, steady sweep. 2,000 acres of grass and stone, gullies where wind had carved shallow scars into the soil. Fences stitched with weather and rust. 3 seasons had passed since fever took Miriam, and every morning since had been a careful sharpening of habit. Saddling, counting cattle, checking posts, sending men where they must go, rituals that steadied a life reduced to necessary tasks. The nearest town lay 20 miles away. That distance had become a shield rather than a mere measure. Trips to Helena were typically for trade or medical purposes, rather than social gatherings. He kept ledgers, a drawer of letters he did not open, and a silence in the house like dust. Sometimes he slept on the porch listening to wind fold itself over the fields and testing whether absence might become a companion. The stove bore the blackened mark of long use. A kettle sat at readiness, and the chair in the parlor still held the faint imprint of a woman who had once moved like a season through that room. When the wagon's dust appeared on the lane, the sight was small against his wide land, but large enough to unbalance him. A child guided it through the grit with an odd steadiness. Clara was 8, but the set of her jaw and the economy of her motions belonged to someone who had been forced to grow up faster than the weather. Her hands were raw where rains had bitten, her dress bore patches of different cloth, her boots had rubbed stubborn heels into blisters. Beside her a smaller child lay folded in a shawl, folded as if to be kept, as if warmth itself could be tucked around a body and held fast. Elias had learned the private geometry of death when Miriam's fever had collected her like a quiet storm. That memory returned now, familiar and fresh, as he saw Mary's face pale in the fading light. Clara drew the wagon up by the gate and spoke without theatrics. Words paired to necessary truth. "My ma's dead," she said. "We were going to Helena. Papers said her brother would be there. We have no food. Can we have milk?" The request landed like a blunt fact. For months he had kept doors closed against strangers and against the pitying looks that would remind him of his own amputated life. Yet these children, who had pulled a body across plains and kept sleep in the small hours between them, loosened a calcified place within him. What was answered was not only pity, but the strange dangerous tenderness that sometimes follows grief, a stirring like thaw at the root. He crossed the yard with the deliberate gait of a man whose life was measured by chores. Up close the children revealed the particulars of their journey, dirt under their fingernails, to grit the faint, sour scent of milk long consumed, a shawl mended at the corners with careful stitches. Emma's breath was quick and thin. When Elias touched Mary's wrist, there was no pulse, only the dry map of veins. He wrapped his coat around the corpse, as if fabric might lend warmth against a world indifferent to need. Clara did not flinch. She rested a small hand on her mother's shoulder, as if to mark possession, as if touch might anchor the person they had just lost. Practicalities mounted, and Elias met them with the same steady mind he applied to fence repair. He set a kettle on the stove and coaxed a fire, swept a spare room and aired linens kept for rare guests, and sent a hand to fetch a milking pail from the barn. The ranch crew arrived with low murmurs, faces made of habit, and questions held thinly. One man moved the wagon to shelter, another fetched blankets. Elias instructed without speaking of his feelings. He gave orders that arranged the house for living rather than for spectacle. Inside, Clara tended to Emma with a tenderness that made Elias ache. She warmed a cloth and pressed it to the child's forehead, humming a broken song that made the room feel less like an emergency and more like a place where gentleness might be practiced again. When Elias lifted Emma, she felt like a small fragile thing that trusted instinctively. Her eyes opened and held his with quiet absolution. A trust as startling as the sunrise after a winter, where light had been scarce. He carried her into the spare room and set her beneath blankets, watching the rise and fall of a breathing body that had been so close to slipping away. Days rearranged themselves into a new rhythm shaped by necessity. Clara learned chores with a concentration born of hunger's clarity, chopping kindling, sweeping the kitchen, feeding hens, learning the names of tools she had never used. She watched Elias as a pupil studies an artisan, absorbing not only instruction but the way he measured patience. He taught her how to coax a skittish colt toward a halter, how to cup a hand so a calf would investigate rather than flee, how to mend a fence post without frightening a mare. Each small lesson acted like scaffolding for both their lives, practical repairs that also mended a frayed domestic trust. At night, when the wind came off the hills and rattled shutters, Elias found himself standing by the window longer than habit demanded, the barn's silhouette cut into the sky, and lamplight keeping Mary's body company cast a small circle in the dark where he could see Clara, folding a blanket or mending a seam. Memory arrived as an unbidden companion, Miriam laughing while naming a foal, the ordinary miracle of a shared supper. He found his hands reaching not always to work but to small mercies, boiling water for a fevered brow, smoothing hair from a child's cheek, setting out biscuits for a hungry mouth. Among Mary's effects, Elias found papers folded flat and kept in a pocket, a name, a street in Helena, a hurried note that spoke of kin and the brittle hope of being known. Reading by lamplight, those lines revealed the plan that had guided Clara's courage. She had followed instructions scrawled in illness and faith, traveled nights on scant directions because a scrap of paper promised an end to hunger. Elias felt the weight of decisions settle like frost. He could send them on the road again, trust a promise inked by someone who might be gone, or he could fold these thin lives into a house that had known loss and could offer steadiness in return. The choice was not philosophical but practical: beds, provisions, the dull arithmetic of care, and the legal work that might follow. He paced the threshold of the spare room and listened to the soft breaths from the bed where Emma slept. The ranch had weathered seasons that taught men how to endure. Now it would be asked to shelter more than cattle. In that widening he sensed a possibility that felt like slow repair, an answer to grief's loneliness, and perhaps if fate permitted a family. Elias set a tin bowl on the table and moved with a gentleness that belied his size. The kettle hissed softly as he ladled warm milk into the metal, each splash tiny and careful, as if measured for fragile glass. Clara watched from the doorway, shoulders squared, though hands trembled, a small soldier tired of battle yet firm in duty. Emma lay pale beneath a woolen shawl, lashes fluttering like moth wings, breathing with a thin steady rhythm that made Elias hold his own breath until the rhythm steadied him in return. He placed the bowl on the rug and waited while Clara crossed the room with the slow certainty of someone practicing mercy. She cradled the cup and guided it to Emma's lips, 2 fingers lightly steadying the smaller chin, lips coaxing a sip that caught like sunlight on thin ice. The child drank, and his eyes brightened a fraction. A small sound escaped, part relief and part bewildered recognition that nourishment might still arrive. Elias watched with a tenderness that felt unfamiliar and welcome, like a door he had nearly forgotten how to open. Clara spoke in a low voice while she stroked Emma's forearm, words unadorned compressed to essentials: where they'd been, how father felt a fever in a week and left them with nothing but memory, how Mary had grown worse until coughing rattled her nights and the wagon became their world. She described nights when the moon was a bitter coin and rations were found in pockets of barns abandoned long before, how thirst gnawed and hunger pressed bones inward, how nights braided cold and fear into one unbroken ache. The tale she told had a raw clarity that made Elias wince with recognition of the landscape such hardship carved on a child. Her voice steadied with each memory, rather than fracture she seemed to gather purpose. The kind of resolve forged in the school of survival. When she paused, Elias imagined the small hands that had been forced to tend a dying man, to lift and fold blankets with care that younger people rarely know. Compassion uncoiled inside him, slow and inevitable. He asked practical questions, learning about roads, names, last helpers, and details that would make the unknown concrete and therefore actionable. Which path had they taken? Who had last shared bread, and which papers they carried? Clara answered without flourish, precise as a ledger, and ordinary facts shone like living hooks under his skin. As she spoke, Emma traced the shawl's edge with a nub of a hand, fingers weak but intent, the motion like a small promise. Elias felt his own solitude fray around these small acts. Memory of Miriam arrived like scent from an open window, a laugh at a hearth, the way she laid out a plate for a late worker. Those recollections mingled with present needs, until tending these two felt both practical and reverent. He refilled the bowl and showed Clara a measured technique, tilting the vessel, watching how she set the cup to avoid choking. She learned with swift attention, grateful in a manner that softened him, and as Emma swallowed more steadily, a warmth bloomed within Elias that was neither mere memory nor the satisfaction of duty. It was akin to the first green after frost. Night entered with a wind that rattled shutters, but inside motion slowed to gentle ministrations and shared breath. Elias made a bed in the spare room, folding blankets in layered refuge, and Clara settled beside Emma until sleep deepened. He lingered by the door, watching the small backs rise and fall beneath quilts, and felt a protective steadiness take root. Over supper the three ate quietly. The cuisine tasted altered when hunger had been long and sharp, each mouthful threaded with the notion of scarcity overcome for a single evening. She learned ranch rhythms with an eagerness that betrayed both a sense of necessity and an appetite for belonging. He taught how to stir feed without spilling, how to check troughs at dusk, and how to carry coal so that embers did not leap. In those lessons, practical skill was braided with a tacit trust. Clara replied with a seriousness that suggested a child bearing much, yet sometimes laughter surprised them like a bird and left Elias smiling despite himself. Work took the edge off worry. Dawn found them moving in a choreography that stitched meaning into hours. Elias fixed a harness while Clara tended to the hens, and hummed a lullaby her mother had taught her. Domestic music made the house feel inhabited rather than enduring. He permitted small mercies, warm broth when coughs returned, a guiding hand for sewing, an extra biscuit tucked into a pocket for brittle mornings. Each kindness loosened grief's hard hold, making room for purpose formed slowly through service. Clara anchored days with tiny rituals, buttons counted, boots braided, bedding smoothed, practices that converted survival into pattern. She kept Mary's shawl folded in a corner not as a relic but a companion, a cloth faint with the memory of hands that once stitched life together. Evenings found Elias opening cupboards where Miriam's small things rested, candlesticks, a faded ribbon, recipe scraps, and inventories kept practicality from becoming nostalgia. Clara read to Emma from a scrap, where a lullaby sat, and the child's sleep deepened into a steadier rest. Once Elias discovered a letter pressed inside a boot, addressed to a brother in Helena. The ink wavered, the message bearing fevered hope that kin would stand where strangers could not. Those lines carried both the weight of what they had endured and the fragile promise that had sent Clara on that wagon. He resolved without flourish that the ranch would serve as an immediate haven. Law and ledger could follow after bodies were strengthened and plans formed. Arranging a note to Helena, preparing to call a doctor when funds allowed, teaching Clara to write names neatly for forms. These practical steps felt like scaffolding for a future. For now he pressed his palm to Emma's brow, a quiet pledge, and began arranging the small domestic universe beneath the eaves that would hold them while time and care did their patient work. Routines settled, chores gave the house a new cadence, and neighbors offered small provisions with quiet manners. An older ranch hand taught Clara to judge a colt's temperament, to stand steady where fear might make others flee. Emma learned to count eggs, turning careful work into play until laughter flushed her cheeks. Occasional trips into town brought supplies and the kind of guarded goodwill that comes in tins and sacks, rather than speech. Elias wrote a brief letter to Helena and left it at the post office. then prepared for a slow wait by arranging beds and learning how to patch a roof seam against summer storms. Snow came, and with it nights where Clara and Emma shared stories by lamplight, and the house felt less hollow. One night, the younger laughed at a crooked hat, and the sound unsealed something tender in Elias, a sudden warmth that made his hands steady when he boiled broth. These small acts, a stitch, a loaf, a lesson, wove a cautious safety into daily life, proving that care could be deliberate and durable when offered without condition. Over weeks the ranch became a shelter shaped by patient labor. At dusk, Elias carried Mary from the parlor into the wide barn with careful motions learned from seasons when sorrow had to be managed rather than mourned. His shoulders braced beneath a bundle of linen and the weight of finality. He placed her upon a pallet of fresh straw beneath the rafters, which kept the smell of hay and the faint sweetness of summer, smoothing a shawl across her forehead, cooled by fever and the evening breeze, as though fabric could seal out the loneliness of the ending. The barn offered privacy, where the ordinary tasks of animals and feed could quietly mask the extraordinary fact of death. Animals lowed beyond a gate, and a lantern threw a small circle of yellow light, where hands moved in discreet kindness. Ranch hands moved about with respectful distance, not prying but present, bringing blankets and closing doors against the wind. One man laid a plank near the pallet so stumbling feet would not stray, and another arranged a bowl of water for washing cold skin. Clara stood at the doorway with Emma clutched to her chest, the younger child small and trembling but alive enough for breath to catch against a throat. Clara's face had grown composed in ways that made Elias ache because composition required lessons no child should learn, lips compressed against worry and duty, and when she met his eyes, something like permission passed between them without speech. Elias felt a rush of protectiveness that surprised him, a stubborn warmth that unlatched the tight seam of his solitude. He moved with practical steadiness, attending to the horses, checking the tack and ensuring the barn was secure for the night. In pockets of silence the wind reminded him of Miriam with a voice that was memory more than sound, and sometimes that recollection softened his steps. After the chores Elias returned to the lantern and to the papers he had found tucked into Mary's satchel, each folded page a breadcrumb back to a life hurried by illness. The documents bore a name and a town in Helena where a brother named Thomas might await news or provide shelter if he still lived. He traced handwriting with a thumb that trembled not from age but from the sudden gravity of responsibility placed upon his porch. Clara answered questions with the economy of someone whose days had been compressed to essentials, marking routes, naming farms passed, reciting the last friendly stop where bread had been shared. She told how fever had stolen strength until Mary could scarcely stand and how nights had been spent rocking and whispering rather than sleeping. Emma listened to the shawl, and when she made a small sound it meant hunger had eased slightly with the presence of warmth and company. Elias poured a cup of warm milk and watched Clara cradle it with hands that shook just enough to reveal the enormity of her task. She taught herself gentleness in gestures that were economical yet wholly human, guiding the cup to Emma's lips in a motion that stitched two fragile lives together. Each swallow seemed to stitch not only flesh and appetite, but also small strands of trust between the girl and a man who had been alone long enough to forget he could be needed. Word of the wagon spread through the homestead and neighbors arrived bearing small provisions and condolences, their faces lined with weather and quiet judgments that softened when they saw children. Elias organized the men to fashion a simple coffin later, a sober plan that honored the dead without turning living rooms into stages for grief. He wrapped Mary's shawl around the bundle once more and tucked personal things into a box, keeping them nearby as if belongings could keep identity present. In the lamplight he read the note addressed to Thomas and learned that Mary had hoped kin would provide a final place amid illness, a hope that had pushed Clara onto the road. The thought of the child steering a wagon across plains with only a scrap of directions made heat rise in Elias, a heat that meant urgency rather than anger. That night he sat on a stool near the pallet and listened to Clara hum a melody her mother had murmured while mending shirts, a tune that turned the barn into a small sanctuary. He considered the options with the practical mind of a rancher: send the girls on to Helena despite uncertain promises, leave them in town under the watchful eyes of strangers, or bring them into his care and face questions from neighbors and the law alike. Law and charity intersected oddly in remote places, guardianship required time and signatures, and sometimes money that did not sit comfortably in a man who had learned to measure worth in hay bales rather than ink. Elias felt the strain between civic duty and human compassion, the two forces pulling like tides until he could no longer tell which would claim him. His wife's memory, often a tender ache, became counsel in that quiet, reminding him of the small kindnesses she would have offered without Clara watched as he read the papers, and in that small exchange, something changed. Fear did not leave entirely, but it was joined by a fragile hope that had gathered in the air like late frost. He envisioned starting with simple acts: a bed, regular meals, tending a cough with broth, and a letter to the post for Helena to explain the situation. To register guardianship might mean town magistrates and an obstinate clerk, but he had patience measured in seasons and a will sharpened by law. As dawn edged into the yard, Elias spoke aloud to shape his choices, promising a shelter while he sought Thomas or proof of kin. He felt the ranch hand's watchful presence ripple comfort through him, their tacit readiness to assist making practical cares less heavy. Clara tied a spare ribbon to Mary's wrist as if marking passage, and Emma slept with a mouth eased by nourishment, small chest rising in steady sleep. Elias folded the note into his breast pocket and decided to delay any journey until both children were stronger and Thomas could be located with certainty. That decision plunged him into new work, arranging a burial with respect, notifying the post in Helena, preparing records and planning provisions for winter if the girls remained. He realized his heart, long encased in a husk of routine, had begun to open in ways that promised responsibility as an answer rather than a burden. The barn, once a simple place for animals and labor, became a liminal space where past and future met beneath the rafters and the scent of tack leather. In that space, grief and resolve braided together, and Elias, reading by lamplight, felt the future lean toward care instead of solitude. He set about practicalities with steady hands that betrayed an internal reckoning, mapping supply runs to town, calculating seed and flour, instructing men to ready a modest funeral mound beneath the old oak, ordering a simple marker when funds allowed, and promising himself that whatever Thomas replied would not unmake the choice born from hearing a child ask only for milk and shelter. Elias hitched the wagon with care, each movement a small ritual that tethered him to the duties he had learned across seasons and storms. The road into town grew narrower in the rear view until homesteads receded into stretches of sun-baked grass and a horizon that seemed endless. Clara kept her hands folded around Emma like an offering, that tight grip saying more than language about protection and obligation. Emma rested against her sister with a trust that had been earned in hours of hush and need, breathing shallow but present as dawn. The trip passed through thin columns of people who watched but did not intrude, the frontier's polite distance visible in lifted hats and quiet nods. Elias felt the weight of their gaze as if it pressed on his back, a collective measurement of what a man owed or refused in these parts. At the little church, the preacher waited under a stoop of weathered wood, his collar plain and his voice practiced in words that could soothe crowds or summon solemnity. The congregation gathered with the measured silence of those familiar with graves and farewells, folding sorrow into gestures they understood as true expression. Clara walked with Emma cradled to her breast, legs steady beneath the small burdens of both youth and duty, a posture that made elders glance away with softened eyes. Elias followed with steady steps, cloak drawn tight against the wind that carried the scent of distant hay and the faint tang of iron where tools had been left in haste. The preacher spoke of rest and passages, and his cadence echoed the sermon Elias remembered from his own wife's burial, a sound like a thin rope carrying meaning. As the shovels moved, the ground complied with honest, reluctant sounds, each scoop folding the earth over time and loss with a solemnity that made the sky feel heavier. Clara's face did not crumple, but the tightness around her mouth marked a sorrow that folded inward rather than spilling outward, an inner reservoir that kept tears at bay. Elias watched her and thought of Miriam's hands, how she had smoothed shirts and mended hearts with similar edges of quiet. The memory clarified rather than soothed him. When the final soil fell, a small wind lifted the shawl from the bundle as if to salute, and someone set a sprig of dried wildflower upon the casket, a humble offering to a life spent in labor and love. Neighbors murmured comfort and left with small parcels: flour, salted meat, a jar of preserves, the practical alms that dressed bereavement in sustenance rather than speech. Word reached them by the telegraph in a square office where wires hummed like distant insects, and the brief message, when delivered, carried weight like a verdict. The telegram stated in plain, clipped language that Thomas had died months prior, a fact that widened the thin circle of those who might claim kin. Clara's posture did not change, but something in her eyes refolded, A new layer of reason settling into place as reality clarified into orphaned fact. Elias felt a cold sharper than the weather at the telegram's edges, for kinship promised and now denied required a response not to happenstance but to necessity. He walked to the edge of the cemetery and pressed knuckles to his jaw, tasting iron of worry as decisions gathered like storm clouds on the prairie. The question pressed him inward: what duty did he now perform? Return the children to a system of distant guardians or bring them back across 2,000 acres to a house that had once been empty and would need filling again? Neighbors crossed themselves in small private rituals, aware of the administrative entanglements that orphanhood demanded, and they exchanged looks that mixed sympathy with practical concern. Elias remembered ledger pages and legal tags, the way citizens would insist on signatures, proofs and counts. He also remembered Miriam's quiet resolve that had always nudged him toward mercy. The preacher's voice took on a quieter tone as he offered a prayer that wrapped the small group in a sentence of kindness. Clara's grip tightened briefly, and she answered with a tiny, barely audible amen. As they returned to the wagon, Clara held Emma differently, cradling her with a fierceness that suggested vows made in silence rather than in words, and Elias felt something inside him yield further. The ride back felt longer in a different way. Boots hollow with thought rather than sky, each turn of the wheel marked by an inward calculus Elias made while attending to practicalities. He stopped to purchase a small folded cross from a general storekeeper who wrapped it in brown paper and pressed it into Elias's palm with an unspoken neighborly steadiness. At supper that night in the kitchen, the table seemed larger with space taken by two small lives, and simple bowls of stew tasted suddenly like a covenant between those who shared them. Clara set Emma by the hearth and smoothed her hair with patient hands, the movement teaching Elias how tenderness might be performed without grand announcement. Conversation that evening skirted administrative matters, names to record, petitions to file, because in these parts care often followed paper before it entered law, and Elias wanted to be careful rather than rash. He wrote a short note to Helena explaining the burial and requesting any kin information, enclosing a coin for postage, and handing the message to a neighbor bound for town the next day. The decision came like a slow thaw. Elias would provide immediate shelter and sustenance while he attempted to verify whether any living relative could claim the girl. This choice was neither dramatic nor selfless in bannered fashion. It was a measured extension of hands that had been used to work, now repurposed for nurture. He thought of the practical obligations: beds, extra feed for winter, schooling later if that became possible, and began to list these as if composing a plan rather than confessing his feeling. At night he found himself rehearsing a voice that would answer neighbors' questions, that he had decided to host while inquiries proceeded, that legal papers would be handled properly, and that children deserved safety before bureaucracy. Clara offered a brief smile once while helping mend a torn sleeve, and Elias felt the value of this small motion like a ledger entry that balanced more than accounts. It balanced trust. The ranch hands adjusted schedules to accommodate more chores, their gruff manners softening into helpfulness as they fetched extra wood and mended harnesses without fuss. Elias taught Clara to mark cattle with a methodical hand, showing how to trace brands and record numbers, a skill that promised livelihood alongside life skills for a child who might one day manage more than a kitchen. They arranged a modest marker for Mary beneath the oak where shade gathered in summer, a place both near and private, and Elias dug with hands that knew soil and sorrow alike. The act of burial became practical scripture, a ritual that honored an absent body while fastening the living to obligations larger than grief alone. When townsfolk asked Elias privately whether he planned to adopt formally, he answered that he would provide for them while making inquiries. Back at the ranch, mornings acquired a steady ritual that made the house feel less like a monument to absence and more like a place where life could be rebuilt. Clara rose with first light, sliding into patched trousers and boots, crossing dew-bright grass to scatter grain for hens and collect eggs trembling in warm straw. She moved with a practical concentration beyond her years, hands steadying tasks that had once been routine for other families, filling troughs, checking fences, carrying water, sweeping plank paths, until dirt surrendered to order. Each small duty answered hunger with structure and taught a child how to turn need into habit. Elias watched those early laborings with a hard attention that softened over weeks. He showed Clara how to hold a halter without spooking a mare, how to read a cow's eye for appetite or ailment, how to approach a colt with small deliberate steps so fear would not multiply. He demonstrated knots, the bowline for secure tying, the clove hitch for temporary hold, and his fingers moved while his voice kept measured time, each repetition teaching steadiness. Jonah, one of the older hands, delighted in teaching rope tricks, looping twine with a practiced flick until the rope sang through air and Clara learned to coax a loop to life. Emma's recovery crept forward in soft increments. She began to speak in clearer phrases, first naming a chicken, then reciting a line from a picture book Jonah had brought from town. One morning she chased a freckled hen across the yard, laughter breaking into bright pieces as she stumbled and rose again, dirt freckling knees like small metal. The sounds struck Elias with a sharp happiness he had thought sealed away. He found himself smiling in ways that relaxed the tightness grief had carved into jaw and shoulders. Their evenings settled into routines of quiet learning and small pleasure. Clay pot stews simmered until meat fell tender, bread was kneaded until elastic, the scent of baking replacing emptiness. Clara practiced mending with focus that made every stitch resemble ceremony. She learned to seam hems and thread needles, proud when seams held fast. Emma arranged wild flowers in a jar and set it on the windowsill where sunlight caught petals and made small altars to beauty. The kitchen table became classroom, workshop and refuge, where lessons in reading or arithmetic arrived between bites and jokes. Work offered a language of trust. Clara learned to open gates for wagons, to read brands like shorthand that told ownership and lineage, to stand at a post and issue instructions men obeyed out of recognition for competence. Jonah's rough praise turned gentler. He nudged her when posture sagged and nodded when a throw found its mark. When a mare balked at a trailer ramp during a late drive, Clara remained steady, holding the lead and whispering until the animal eased. Her calm steadied others, proving resilience can act as compass for a household. There were tests that proved bonds beyond convenience. A storm once tore through pastures, flattening hay and soaking stores. The crew scrambled through mud and rain to salvage bales while Clara and Emma took smaller tasks, gathering scattered feed and sheltering frightened hens. Elias felt fear not for livelihood, but for fragile steadiness itself. That protective strain made him pace through nights like a sentinel. They worked through exhaustion together, and shared labor formed a fabric stronger than any single will. Domestic rituals repaired more than appetite. Baking became nightly practice that returned the house to ritual. Clara learned to score loaves and fold dough until it sang under practiced palms. Emma placed slices on plates and offered them with a pride that warmed cheeks. Sewing circles repaired shirts and spirits alike. Miriam's old quilt lay draped over a chair, its patched stories inviting talk and remembrance rather than letting memory freeze into sorrow. Jonah sometimes whistled a tune his grandfather had hummed, and the children matched needle to whistle until their hands kept rhythm like small instruments. Education and play balanced duty. Elias taught constellations beside the porch lamp, pointing out bright patterns and telling simple stories that anchored myth to maps. Emma traced pictures and asked endless questions about seasons and birds, absorbing answers like thirsty soil. Clara practiced writing names and numbers until ink smudges smoothed into confidence. Ledger entries became proof she could tally feed, measure grain and plan for winter. Learning turned chores into lessons and reclaimed childhood within a life tempered by hardship. Scent was constant. Hay and leather, boiled broth and wet earth after rain, the tang of tallow from lanterns. Those odors carried both memory and stability, reminding Elias of afternoons when Miriam moved through rooms humming, folding ordinary tasks into warmth. He found such recollections less like knives and more like maps pointing toward choices he could still make, to offer shelter that included instruction, discipline, and tenderness. Small moments piled into larger chains. One afternoon Emma chased a rooster through a stubble field, feet thudding, hat lost, laughter erupting until she tumbled into soft hay and rolled, blinking in sun. Clara ran to help, then doubled over laughing at the silliness of it all. Elias, nearby repairing a fence, leaned on a post and watched, chest loosening in a way that felt like healing rather than forgetting. Jonah walked over and clapped the girl's shoulder with rough affection, and the ranch hands shared a smile that tasted like permission to allow joy. Winter brought lessons in measured care. Snow masked tracks and required careful rationing. Feed was portioned, fires tended, nights spent reinforcing shelter. Clara learned to read subtle signs in cloud and wind, how a certain sky meant ice along creek edges, and how animal breath fogged outlines with meaning. She carried coal with a firm gait that displayed endurance and competence. Elias watched adaptation with a pride he seldom permitted himself to name. Occasional shadows intruded. Clara sometimes woke from nightmares, hands clenched and calling softly for a mother who would not return. Elias sat by her bed, palms steady, offering a voice without flourish but full of presence, waiting, warming, breathing slowly together until calm returned. Those quiet vigils taught him how to be father without title. Practice, not declaration, made family. As months slid into seasons, patient repetition embroidered the ranch into a true home. Bonds formed not by ceremony but by daily acts. Teaching a girl to mend a fence, celebrating a rooster chase that ended in hay, tracing letters on a page beneath lamplight. Emma's laughter became as common as morning dew. Clara's competence grew into quiet leadership. Elias found himself smiling often, an honest crease around eyes formerly fixed in sorrow. The scent of hay and leather threaded days and gave them a regard rather than fate alone. Daily care transformed grief into belonging, and hope settled over their days steadily. Winter wrapped the ranch in hush and white, each morning arriving like a careful apology with soft light, and the faint noise of animals stirring beneath layered blankets of snow. Clara woke from a nightmare with the urgency of a small animal, and called for a mother who would not answer. Voice breaking the quiet like a single fragile bell. Elias heard the call and rose without hesitation, moving across boards that remembered his wife's steps, and bringing steady hands to a room that feared being empty again. He sat beside the child and offered more than words, a presence practiced by years of waking to chores, a steady breathing that matched the pace of the hearth. She clung for a moment, body folding into his like a shape seeking anchor, and his arm found the correct hold as if muscle remembered tenderness from a past life. His voice steadied her fears when he said simply, "You are safe here," and the sentence acted like a keel righting the small terror that had unseated her sleep. The house took on ritual to keep winter ordinary. Water warmed, boots dried, broth simmered in a pot whose thin steam promised warmth rather than merely filling a stomach. Clara moved with determined efficiency, feeding hens, stacking kindling, checking the henhouse door as if tasks could translate scarcity into habit and thus promise continuity. Emma, gaining voice each day, sat near the stove and practiced naming birds and counting pebbles until her small talks braided into laughter that eased rooms and hands. Elias taught work with demonstration and patience, showing how to halter a mare without startling it, how to find subtle signs of illness, and how to mend a broken gatepost. He instructed in small increments so lessons felt like scaffolding. Tie this knot, tamp this seam, watch this animal's flank for heat, measure feed with a steady hand. Jonah and the other ranch hands softened toward the girls, offering rope tricks and gruff approval, shaping a perimeter of care that was part custom and part genuine warmth. Snowstorms tested the new balance, demanding extra work and long hours to secure hay and shelter livestock. They labored together and shared tasks until exhaustion became plain proof of solidarity. Clara learned to throw a loop for cattle and to mark numbers on tags, skills that promised a future where knowledge could translate into autonomy and community respect. Emma chased a chicken one afternoon and fell into a heap of hay laughing. The sound landed in Elias with a peculiar relief, a balm that eased grief rather than erasing memory. He began the paperwork required to transform temporary shelter into legitimate guardianship, moving through forms and stamps with the same determination he gave to any needed repair. Signatures were slow operations for him, unfamiliar in their inked demand, yet he approached each line with a practical resolve that made legalities instruments of care rather than obstacles. The magistrate's office required proofs, references and a small fee. Elias prepared witnesses among men who could attest to his steadiness and produced ledgers that recorded his livelihood. A letter returned from Helena stating no kin found at the listed address, folding the possibility of family into absence and reframing the decision toward permanence rather than fleeting refuge. He folded that letter with a practiced hand and set it aside, recognizing that the absence of claim changed the calculus. These children might become family by consent and work. Clara practiced writing names and neat numbers until her script resembled ledger entries, a small ceremony that anchored identity and taught administrative survival as much as practical literacy. Emma learned to thread beads and count aloud, turning small tasks into games that both entertained and instructed, making play into training for a life that demanded resourcefulness. Nights still yielded nightmares, and when Clara stirred, Elias rose without complaint, sitting beside her bed and whispering weather and chores until her breathing eased. His voice steadied her fears by repeating small facts about the ranch brand names to watch for, which gate to open when wind bent fences, familiarities that both soothed and educated. He offered gentle reminders of his intention: shelter until kin appeared, or if none appeared, a home grounded in work and mutual care, a place where childhood could be rebuilt. Neighbors brought small provisions in knitted caps, their motions plain and kindly, and through those ordinary gifts the social world acknowledged the children without turning their lives into spectacle. The gentleness of normal days repaired frayed edges, Clara mending a tear while Jonah whistled, Emma setting wild flowers in a jar, kitchen smells marking a routine that made the house lived rather than endured. Elias remembered Miriam often, her laughter while ironing shirts, the way she set a table with small bows folded into napkins, and he told stories of such smallness to the girls rather than melancholic elegies. Learning and labor together wove new habits. Clara's competence in field tasks earned nods from hands once skeptical, and she grew into responsibilities that replaced fear with confidence. Practical challenges cemented bonds. A blizzard tore fences and they worked through the white to rescue stock, hauling bales shoulder to shoulder until night became a quiet testimony of survival. Winter also allowed small triumphs, a loaf risen high, a pot of stew that fed more than hunger, Emma's laughter becoming a repeated note that brightened rooms like a lamp. One evening beneath clear stars, Elias completed the guardianship forms, signing with a hand that quivered briefly and then steadied into decision. He filed papers at town and returned with an official stamp. He explained the outcome to Clara by the hearth, saying his signature made caring lawful and that he intended to honor that legal promise by action, not simply by word. Then by lamplight he offered a question meant for a wider ear than the room alone. Where have you found family when you least expected it? The question hung like a small challenge to memory and to readers alike. Clara responded not in full sentences but by placing Mary's shawl against her cheek and handing it to Elias, a silent exchange that consecrated trust and memory together. They slept with easier breaths that night, a shared heat warding off fear, and Elias watched snow move across the land, knowing that law and love had now conspired to keep these children from walking alone. Outside the ranch lay a continent of sleeping fields, but inside a hearth glowed steady and small, and the promise of guardianship had shifted the house from shelter into home. Morning after morning Elias rose with a steadier purpose and found that chores, schooling, and small celebrations built a life of quiet durability around the children so that months would pass, and the memory of being alone would live only in stories told beside the fire, a past that shaped them without owning the rest of their day. Neighbors who once maintained polite distance gradually brought help that was neither intrusive nor pitying. Friendships formed in the slow labor of seasons, and the girls learned to expect kindness as natural rather than rare, and gratitude settled into daily rhythm. Spring unrolled across the plains with a promise of renewal, soft green returning where winter's hold had hardened soil. On the ranch, the days now carried a rhythm that no longer felt provisional but whole, stitched with the laughter of children and the steady reassurance of work. Clara rode a chestnut mare at dawn with growing confidence, her posture upright, her hands sure as the reins answered her touch. She had practiced long hours, first wobbling with uncertain balance, then mastering how to lean into the rhythm of the animal. Jonah whistled as he watched her circle the paddock, pride flashing in the squint of his eyes. The men spoke of her as though she had been raised among them all along. Emma trailed near the rails, hair streaming, calling encouragement in bright notes that lifted the morning air. Her voice had grown playful, words tumbling in quick succession as if silence had been banished forever. She carried a doll fashioned from cloth and straw, treating it like a partner in games that wandered from pasture to creek, her imagination filling spaces once claimed by sorrow. Elias felt the transformation not only in the girls but in himself. He moved differently, still deliberate, but with a lightness that had not touched his stride in years. The ranch no longer felt like a place of echoes but of sound. Children's chatter, horses nickering, the creak of saddles, the laughter that spilled unguarded. Each day reminded him of Miriam's dream that a home should resound with voices, that walls should keep more than silence. At supper he often caught himself smiling without effort, the sight of Clara dividing bread with Emma stirring a gratitude too deep for words. The adoption papers had arrived from town with their official stamps, the ink binding what had already been sealed in spirit. Elias had signed with a hand steadied by conviction, no longer hesitant but certain that these two belonged under his roof, not temporarily but forever. The magistrate's approval had been perfunctory, neighbors signing as witnesses with quiet gladness. And when he brought the news home, Clara's eyes brightened in a way that needed no tears to explain its meaning. Emma clapped her small hands and declared the house theirs with the kind of certainty only a child can carry. On a bright afternoon Elias and the ranch hands raised a sign at the gate, each plank plain, smooth and carved with careful strokes. Clara had pleaded for a name that honored the plea which first bound them, Milk River Ranch, and he granted it without debate. The words cut into wood bore more than letters. They bore history, grief, and renewal bound into one declaration. The hands hammered stakes, dust rising with each blow, and when the final nail sank the ranch stood newly christened. Clara's pride shone as she placed her palm against the sign, a gesture of ownership and belonging. Her shoulders squared with joy that came not from survival alone but from identity claim. The men cheered in their quiet, rough way, Jonah tossing his hat into the air while others nodded with satisfaction. Supper that evening turned into celebration. A roast was shared, a fiddle played by one of the younger hands, and Emma danced clumsily on the boards, her giggles rising higher than the music. Clara leaned into Elias's side with a comfort once unthinkable, and he rested a hand gently on her shoulder, feeling the truth of family in that simple act. He realized then how grief had not been erased but transformed, sorrow bent into strength and purpose, and memory honored by the new life thriving around him. As the fire burned low and stars layered the dark sky, Elias reflected quietly. He remembered the night Clara had whispered for milk, the exhaustion in her eyes, the frailty of Emma clutched tight, and how those words had broken into his solitude like a storm tearing open the sky. Now months later the house was warm with presence, the land resounded with activity, and his own heart was fuller than he could have believed. He thought not of endings but of beginnings, not of what had been lost but of what had been built. Leaning on the porch rail he allowed himself a single question, voiced inward but meant for anyone who might hear the story. What small moment changed your life forever? For him it had been a whisper at dusk, fragile and pleading, reshaping a widower's fate into that of a father. He hoped others might answer for themselves, finding recognition in unexpected kindness, in a hand offered, in a chance encounter that became a turning. The ranch settled into night, lanterns dimming one by one, leaving only starlight on the sign at the gate. Elias carried the memory of the day with him as he closed the door, the echo of children's laughter lingering like music. What once had been a lonely homestead now breathed with unity, with renewal, with quiet joy that promised endurance. And beneath that vast Montana sky, Milk River Ranch stood not as a monument to loss, but as a testament to found family, where sorrow had been met with compassion, and compassion had bloomed into belonging. 10 years had passed, and time had softened edges, while sharpening what mattered most. Milk River Ranch carried a history now embroidered with small victories and everyday rituals that testified to endurance. On a late summer afternoon the three of them walked the lane where dust pooled golden and wind moved the grass in waves like a living sea. Clara, 18 now, rode ahead briefly, then dismounted to stand by the gate, hands on hips, eyes steady as someone who intended to steward land and people with care. Her posture spoke of lessons absorbed in long daylight hours, mending fences, tallying stock, waking early for feed, negotiating a stubborn mare, reading weather by cloud and bird. Emma favored gentler pursuits. Books had become her passport and wonder, pages filling afternoons when chores allowed, stories teaching geography and speech, and dreams broader than the valley. At Mary's modest grave beneath the old oak they paused, carrying a sprig of prairie flowers plucked for memory and gratitude. The marker remained simple, a stone with a name carved plain, but each year small bouquets returned to honor a mother who had offered everything she could. Clara knelt and smoothed the grass beside the marker, palms meeting soil as if touch might translate absence into reason to carry forward. Emma read aloud a passage about roads and home and the kindness that binds strangers into family, and the voice made the afternoon feel like an offering. Elias watched and felt a fullness that steadied breath. Sorrow had settled into kinship-shaped meaning rather than the raw ache of new loss. He remembered the night Clara whispered a plea for milk and how those words rerouted a solitary life into shared purpose. Neighbors stopped by with pies and market news, bringing help when storms threatened and rendering the ranch less an island than a node within community. Clara spoke of plans with practical brightness, new corrals, a small orchard, a tidy ledger, hiring another hand when harvest demanded muscle. Elias advised gently and often, but mostly he learned to watch as a young woman assumed responsibility with skill and a deliberate heart. Emma curated a tiny library in the parlor where Miriam's faded quilt draped a chair and visiting children borrowed volumes and left footprints of laughter. The house hummed with purpose from dawn until dark. The porch, once a silhouette of solitude, turned into a place where neighbors traded weather reports and small comforts. That evening the neighbors held a modest celebration, a potluck with music where a fiddle rose and laughter moved light across the yard. Clara danced near the barn while Emma clapped on the rail between pages, and the men cheered in a rough affectionate way that suited their manner. Elias stood by a post and watched them, feeling stitches of gladness mend something tender and fragile within his chest. He discussed schooling options for Clara if the young woman wished beyond ranch management, but she smiled in half because leaving felt less likely than staying to grow roots. Still, she dreamed of seeing a distant valley where certain birds nested, and Emma promised to map courses, so wilderness might feel less foreign. The anniversary invited reflection: 10 harvests, storms weathered, births, and small deaths, reconciliations stitched from work and talk around a table. On the porch at sunset, Elias told stories about Miriam not as lament but as living instruction, how she measured kindness in gestures, how she set places for unexpected guests. Clara listened, sometimes closing eyes to weave memory and guidance into decisions that would serve others in ways she had learned by watching. Emma squeezed Elias's hand with a gravity that said more than speech, and Elias returned the squeeze with a blink that acknowledged. The ranch felt less like property and more like covenant, land giving sustenance in exchange for stewardship and presence, family returning care and daily practice. They walked boundary lines together as dusk softened into purple and river light glinted like metal working under. Elias considered change not as cure but as patient alteration, small mercies that shifted sorrow into purpose one day at a time. He remembered nights counting losses and the night a small girl drove a wagon into his lane to ask for milk. That memory had rerouted his life. Sometimes he thought holding that single asked question in mind was like holding a compass that guided how he answered need thereafter. As darkness pooled, lanterns lit along paths and dogs settled with contented sighs, the three climbed the porch steps to watch a sunset that felt like promise. Clara leaned into Elias's shoulder and Emma rested against their knees, book closed for the hour, stories living inside them as quiet fuel. Elias inhaled deep the scent of hay and tallow and let the ranch's ordinary sounds settle across his chest like a warm blanket. He asked then, both warmly and slightly mischievously, a question meant to pull strangers into shared memory: their next chapter will leave you speechless. Share a moment that changed your life in the comment. The invitation hung in the air like a bell, designed to gather strangers into the fold where private acts become lore and small mercies count as gospel. They watched the sun sink behind hills that had borne more than seasons, feeling time fold past loss into future possibility. Elias pictured Clara running a trail crew teaching ropecraft and stewardship while Emma catalogued birds and lent books to neighbors, futures rooted in present care. He felt whole not because sorrow vanished but because love multiplied where absence once claimed space, and because action had followed a whispered plea. At night a lamp burned low and someone read aloud until sleep softened voices. The house kept uncomplicated sound that was honest and domestic. The ranch sign caught moonlight and cast a shadow across the path. Children's voices dissolved into sleep's hush and Elias felt gratitude shaped like a steady peace. He promised himself to tend, to instruct patience and skill, to answer a knock at their gate with a seat and a bowl rather than suspicion. Morning would bring routine: repair, feed, teach, play, argue, laugh, and sometimes repair again. Cycles simple yet sustaining built their days into a life durable and kind. They remained a small constellation of care beneath a vast sky, bound by labor and vow and the stories they told beside a fire. As the last color left the prairie, Elias touched their hands and felt gratitude settle like quiet snow that layered new ground into something ready to bear weight. He remembered how a tiny plea rearranged trajectory and how answering it had reshaped everything from solitude into belonging. Neighbors sometimes leaned over rails to offer advice about markets and bred animals, and those exchanges taught the girls negotiation and compassion in equal measure. Practical schooling paired with moral learning that stitched them deeper into communal life. Children from nearby homesteads visited often, borrowing tools and stories, chasing fireflies at dusk while learning to mend broken things. Together they proved small mercies build lasting legacies and offer hope across generations. All small traditions multiplied and softened each coming winter night.